We bring to you Dr. James Slaughter doing the first of seven presentations on Antietam and the Maryland campaign of 1862. Take the floor.
Oh, thank you very much, Chris. Okay, so where I want to start is understanding the strategic situation in late summer of 1862, and where I want to begin this discussion is actually with kind of the war to date by the time we get to 62, with a focus on the summer before we get to Antietam. Um, the let's see, I need to go back one. There we go. Okay, the context of the American Civil War is interesting, and I've taught this topic at every level from high school to grad school, and I always seem to start here because there always seems to be some question about this, at least in the United States. So the context of this war is it's the outcome of a slow but significant divide over the institution of slavery from the 18th century until 1860 in the election. A series of compromises, really beginning honestly with the Northwest Ordinance in 1785, the Constitution, Missouri Compromise, arguments over self-determination, the Missouri Compromise, California being added as a free state, and then the Fugitive Slave Act. And we could make an hour easy of discussing any one of these individual topics. But what they are is all of these are really an attempt to keep the Union together that has a fairly divisive issue when it comes to the issue of slavery, because by 1780, you've already got, in the middle of the Revolution, states like Pennsylvania are already starting to eliminate slavery. And it's already becoming an issue by the mid 1780s. And then obviously, the story of Eli Whitney and the cotton gin and this boom you get in slavery, especially after the Louisiana Purchase and the discovery that now you can make cotton into a very productive and profitable product rather than something that's very labor intensive and time consuming. You go from 1 pound of processed cotton a day per person to 50, and now you have the perfect land to grow it, and it's hot and humid. And the result is the growth of the institution of slavery from the mid 1790s until obviously the end of the American Civil War. In the 1850s, this violence expands, and where there is some consternation and there is some isolated little bits of violence associated with the institution of slavery itself, as far as the political differences go, it devolves into an erstwhile sort of miniature civil war in the 1850s with Kansas, and then of course with the John Brown raid in Harper's Ferry in 1859. Politically speaking, getting up to this point where we're tracing in the 1840s and 1850s to get to the 1860 election is the demise of the Whig Party, the rise of the Republican Party, and the split of the Democratic Party. And all of these in and of themselves are actually quite important. The Whig Party itself is where a lot of the compromise had originated in Washington. And the Whigs had done a decent job for a while of kind of patching enough compromises together to keep the states together. But especially when you see the split of the Democratic Party and the rise of the Republican Party, you've got a serious issue, and it's going to, the road seems almost inevitable. From retrospectively, in the 1850s, maybe not so much, because even after John Brown's raid, there was a lot of panic in the South, certainly, but the talk of secession in 1859 wasn't nearly as prevalent. It was more of a talk of a worry or concern over servile insurrection, a slave rebellion in the South. The Democratic Party splitting between North and South in some ways is more important, because you've got the Northern Democrats who don't necessarily want to abolish slavery, but don't approve of the institution spreading, and the Southern Democrats who want to preserve the institution of slavery, but also want to see it spread to all 50 states. And those of you who are familiar with this, there are many things that I've left out of this. Lots of material by abolitionism, obviously, Frederick Douglass. There's a lot here, but this is the real origin of the American Civil War, and this peels through honestly a lot of the post-war lost cause mythology, etc. Um, the election of 1860, and I put a copy of the electoral map that you can see there, is a mishmash of candidates actually running. And what you see there, Lincoln, Douglas, Breckinridge, and Bell, are the four representatives of the parties that are running at that time. Lincoln, obviously being a Republican, Douglas was the Northern Democrat, Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, and then Bell, who was a candidate running on the Constitutionalist Union Party, who's kind of a third party candidate, more or less. Now, in modern terms, this would look really confusing because, well, why do you have two Democratic parties? But that explanation just preceded the slides because the feelings really that both the different parties have regarding the issue of slavery. And then the wild card in there with the Constitutional Union Party taking three states, two of which would later secede, Tennessee and Virginia, one of which wouldn't, Kentucky. The Republicans were avowedly abolitionists, but Lincoln, before the election, made it clear that he did not see it was in his power as president and the powers and invested him in the Constitution to eliminate slavery. However, the fact the Republican Party was abolitionist pretty much at its core scared most of the South. Lincoln does not appear on the ballot in 9 Southern states, so you can't even vote for him. And after he wins the election in November of 1860, South Carolina secedes on December 20th, 1860, and really kind of starts the country on the road to war at that point. 1861. The way I always try to explain 1861 from a military point of view is a lot of flailing about. There's not much really gets done at this point. In the very beginning of 1861, especially with the advancement of the secession crisis, you've got a lot of people, especially in the regular army at this point, deciding which side they're going to go to. But if you want to really understand it, if you have any doubt, I always tell people this: if you have any doubt about the cause of the Civil War and why people were fighting it, read the cornerstone speech and the secession documents from 1861. It's crystal clear at this point that the South is seceding to preserve the institution of slavery, and that's really what this is coming down to. Most of us have heard about the Battle of Fort Sumter, April 12th, 1861. In fact, there was fighting before that. It was isolated. I would classify it really as skirmishing more than anything. It was definitely not serious fighting. It was definitely not an outbreak of a war, but there was violence associated with the secession crisis on a military level before this. But this is really what kicks it off. The first major land battle of the war is going to be the Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run, take your preference, fought on July 21st, 1861. The battle itself is interesting from a number of points of view, and there are a lot of personalities that are really made during that battle, including, of course, Stonewall Jackson and his stand on Henry House Hill, and the argument over whether B, who was fatally wounded and didn't live to explain himself, was actually stating that Jackson was, a stone wall and a monument to manliness and perseverance, or whether he was actually interfering with the battle. But and we've all heard the story too about Manassas, where all the civilians from DC come out to watch the battle and then clog the roads on the way back. It's decisively indecisive. Both sides go into this thinking that they're going to win. The Confederacy wins, kind of on a more or less a Hail Mary in the last part of the battle, but it really doesn't solve anything because DC is not occupied. The battle is not, the Union Army is not really pursued after that, and nobody is able to really make any serious headway in 1861. As a really interesting prelude to this, and many people I know who are interested in the American Civil War have never even really looked into this, that Robert E. Lee and George McClellan in 1861 are actually in West Earn. I put Earn in there because it's going to become West Virginia, on their own little campaigns at the time, not really fighting each other directly. And McClellan comes out of this looking, like a rose. His troops are successful. He accomplishes his mission. One of the primary ones is to guard the only real railroad track that runs through the northern part of that part of Virginia at the time. And he does a good job of squelching the little bit of secessionism he runs into because McClellan is operating more toward the northern part of Western Virginia, and most of that was actually pro Union. So he didn't have that many issues. Lee, on the other hand, if you read about his campaign in Western Virginia in 1861, is absolutely embarrassed. Arguably, it could have ended his career. His performance was so bad. And what you really see Lee trying to do in Western Virginia is perform these complex, really Napoleonic maneuvers where you have multiple columns converging on one place at a given time. And the terrain and the road network and the population of the state at that point were simply not going to let that happen. And Lee's campaign is really kind of a joke. He's made fun of in Richmond. The press is not happy with him. And when he returns to Richmond toward the end of 1861 to become Jefferson Davis's military advisor, he thinks that his career might be over other than just keeping a seat warm in Richmond next to Davis, advising him of what might be the best move. And we don't have time, and it doesn't really fit in the context. But if you're familiar with the very prickly nature of Jefferson Davis, you'll understand that might not have been very, very well done either. You're beginning to see the slow implementation of the Anaconda Plan or something like it. The federal plan from the very beginning was to split the Confederacy in south along the Mississippi Valley in the south, to surround it, enforce a blockade, and just squeeze it, start cutting it up into pieces and squeezing it in the middle like an anaconda. And toward the end of 1861, you can begin to see this sort of happen. But there are, of course, issues. There are some serious problems in the first year of the war. If we go from summer to summer, which I think is a pretty logical way to look at the American Civil War, we can see these really popping up in 1861 and to some extent really in 1862. Many of the volunteers on both sides are short term and they're only partially trained. And that's going to cause a significant number of problems for the first 6 to 8 months of the war until both sides figure out that, these 3 month, 6 month volunteers are not going to work. And this war is going to last much longer than both sides thought it would. Both sides are suffering from lack of equipment. There are buyers all over Europe. And the very first thing the Europeans sell to both the Confederate and Union buyers is all of the leftover worn out stuff that's rusting away in warehouses. They're going to sell them to them at exorbitant prices. And then when they come back again, what they're going to do is sell them the newer material or the new material, again, at exorbitant prices because they know both sides really desperately need it, especially through about 1862 for the Union side. By 1863, the Union has a lot of its industrial problems fairly well sorted. One of the big issues, and this is not often looked at, most of the material you see regarding the American Civil War, even from the strategic point of view, very often ignores the naval situation. And although the U.S. Navy is very small in 1861, it has the capacity to expand very quickly. There is basically no Confederate Navy when the war starts. And as the war develops, the Confederate Navy is going to remain quite small. The bulk of the effort in Confederate shipping is going to be isolated to things like fast ships and blockade runners because of the industrial and trade problems the Confederacy has. We don't really examine it in close enough detail, I often think, especially when discussing the strategic situation. The Confederacy, unfortunately for itself, foolishly withheld cotton shipments in 1861, thinking it would force European recognition and kind of play their hand and put a crimp on their economy in order to get them to do what they wanted, but it backfired. What it ended up doing was actually speeding up European adoption of cotton from other regions of the world, and it also shorted the Confederacy a lot of money that it actually desperately needed. However, in 1861 to 62, it was still quite possible European powers might recognize the Confederacy. It's still very much on the table. And it is something the Confederacy desperately wants, and it's something that the Union is terribly afraid of. The reality of the war in 61, all through the war, actually, if we look at this from a reasonable point of view, is the Confederacy does not need to conquer the Union. but the Union does need to conquer the Confederacy. The Confederacy needs to outlast the Union. Okay, that's really what it needs to do. And most Confederate leaders, most Confederate generals, most Confederate politicians are fully cognizant of the fact that they do not have the ability. They don't have the manpower, they don't have the industrial power, and realistically, even they wouldn't have the money to conquer the North. So that's not a question that's really on the table. 1862, things start to develop. And 1862 is going to be the year that the war really changes in many, many ways. One of the very first events of the war is that the small Confederate Navy is going to unleash the CSS Virginia, or the Merrimack, if you'd like to refer to that. It was actually built on the hull of a Union ship that was burned to the waterline previously. And the Virginia was the first ironclad to really go into battle. Now, the other thing is this: you have to understand is ironclads weren't new. The British and the French had been building ironclads in the 1850s, but they never used them. This is just the first time they actually go to fight. On March 8th, 1862, the CSS Virginia destroys the USS Constitution and the Cumberland. And on March 9th, the very next day, the Monitor arrives. And the Monitor is even more of a basically technological revolution than the Virginia, because it has the world's first revolving gun turret on a steam powered ironclad vessel. It is arguably the world's first modern battleship. Um, the very first land battle of the war that really brings a great shock to both nations is Shiloh over April 6th and 7th. This really is kind of it really makes the relationship between Grant and Sherman very, very concrete. Horrendous casualties, over 23,000 over the course of 2 days. The nation is in shock. The entire nation is in shock. And this is a pattern that's just beginning to emerge. Shiloh is going to be the eye opener. And once we get to Antietam and what happens over the course of one day on September 17th, the nation is going to understand that it's gotten itself into something it totally did not expect. And 62 is going to establish the pattern of casualties and the tremendous loss of manpower that we're going to see throughout the entire war. Other important events of 62 that are going to lead us up to the Battle of Antietam and the Maryland campaign. New Orleans, at the mouth of the Mississippi River, falls May 1, 1862. Now, you may ask, well, why does that matter? Because at this point, if you're familiar with the other events that are developing at the time, the Union had actually successfully started to push down the Mississippi from the north in 1861, and was now pushing up the Mississippi from New Orleans, and it was very quickly gobbling up one of the main arteries of the Confederacy. And 1862 is the year that the bulk of the Mississippi River Valley actually becomes the property, more or less, of the Union. It makes it unusable, really, for the Confederacy. So that's a very important strategic facet that often gets overlooked kind of going into this, that original Union plan that's established in 1861 is starting to work. And the Confederacy, all the way through 1862, doesn't really have an effective counter for it. And it doesn't in 63 either. One of the other things that looks very positive for the Union in 62 is the Peninsula Campaign. And this is the plan of George McClellan. McClellan, a very controversial figure for many, many reasons during the American Civil War, has this brilliant idea of, well, instead of trying to batter our way through to Richmond from the Washington side, which has been costly and difficult and frustrating, let's just go around the other way. We have more naval power. We can pull it off. We can keep the supplies intact, and let's go around the end run and come up from the Chesapeake Bay and attack Richmond from the rear, which is what he does. Now, obviously, again, another long discussion over the plotting kind of slow nature of McClellan's advance from the Chesapeake into Richmond. But from April to June of 62, that's exactly what he does. And by the time we get to June, even though it's kind of a slow process, it's not really that grinding, I would argue. It's just very tedious. Um, McClellan is threatening Richmond. I mean, toward the end of April, I'm sorry, toward the end of May '62, it looks like Richmond may fall. Up to this point, Joseph Johnston is actually commanding the forces in and around Richmond, and Johnson is a good commander, and there's a good argument out there for those who want to get into some juicier bits of looking at strategic analysis of Civil War. Is he's one of the few people who really have a concrete understanding of the strategic outlook of the war. Johnson, however, is wounded, and Lee takes command on May 31st, 1862, and that is going to drastically change the nature of the war. For the rest of the war, arguably, for the next year, especially from the summer of '62 to the summer of '63, is going to be uh, really the rise and the focus on Lee. Not to steal the thunder away from Lee, but Stonewall Jackson in the Valley in 1862 is also a fascinating campaign to follow. And what looks like a good war in the West for the Union in '62 is beginning to look like a very frustrating war for the East for the Union in '62, especially after Lee takes command on May 31st. The 7 days battle around Richmond, uh, if you look at most military academies, from my understanding, still teach the 7 days battles. They are really arguably Lee's masterpiece. It's probably Lee at his best. And what Lee is doing is, over the course of a week, driving McClellan away from Richmond, back down basically the route that he came, and McClellan starts to withdraw. Interestingly enough, some of these battles, Seven Pines, White Oak Swamp, Malvern Hill, are some of the battles that the regiments in the, or what will be the Army of Northern Virginia, will really kind of rather revere even after the war as being some of the best fights that they'd ever had. Now, there's a lot of reasons we could debate about this. A lot of it has to do with the fact that Lee turns what looks like an impending defeat into an overwhelming victory. But these battles do really stick in the minds of the men that were there well after the war, just as if you'll, a lot of men who fought at Shiloh will have fought dozens of battles by the end of the war, but will look at Shiloh as the one that they recall the most vividly. McClellan, in retrospect, again, unsurprisingly, withdraws. Now, at the time, that wasn't a big shock. McClellan was thought to be a brilliant strategist. He certainly had a good record up to that point. The Peninsula Campaign almost works, but he makes the decision to withdraw because a number of reasons. Number one, he was soundly beaten, but number two, he's convinced, and this is going to be a pattern with McClellan that we're going to see, that Lee has an enormous amount of men that he never has. McClellan is always writing back throughout '62 to Washington, I'm grossly outnumbered. My scouts and blah, blah, blah are telling me that, Lee has 110, 120, 130,000 men. And through most of this period, Lee's army in one place is never going to be bigger than 40 to 45,000 men. So the 7 days battles really turn that around. And what's going to happen is the 7 days battles, in conjunction with other events, are going to set up what Lee thinks is a key opportunity to invade Maryland and invade Pennsylvania. Now, Lee knows, and the entire Confederacy knows, that there is no possibility of conquering the North. What Lee wants to do, and what he's trying to do in the Maryland campaign of '62, and what he tries to do again in the campaign of 1863 in the summer that culminates at Gettysburg, is force the Union Army somewhere north of Washington, defeat it in detail that will allow him to effectively threaten Washington. Now, would that have ended the war? That's all counterfactual history, and it really doesn't matter. And the other big question is, with all the forts around Washington, could Lee have even reduced them? And that's another big issue we'd have to get into. But the point is that is his thought process. That's what he wants to do. Second Manassas, which is fought shortly thereafter. Lee versus Pope. McClellan is still trying to get his army basically in a position to threaten Lee again. And Second Manassas is another battle that's regarded really as kind of one of Lee's better battles. Pope manages to stave off disaster largely due to the bravery of his troops. One of the things that's really patently unfair and has been written in many times, I think, arguably because of the lost cause mythology more than anything, is that Union troops were not as good, they were not as well trained, they were not as brave, and that's simply not true. Lots of times, the reason that federal troops are defeated is not because they're cowardly, it's not because they're not well trained, it's not because they're not well armed, it's not because they don't know how to fight. It's simply because they're put in incredibly awkward positions that are basically untenable. And that happens at Second Manassas. And for those of you who want a deeper dive into Second Manassas, look at the performance of Stonewall Jackson. It's not great. Matter of fact, it's really kind of underwhelming. But Second Manassas is decisive. It pushes Pope out of the way, and it basically gives Lee a free run at this point. Now he's free to maneuver. He's now to operate the way he wants to operate, and he has significant operational freedom at this point. And what we have is the perfect situation for Lee to start striking some blows in the North against the federal armies that will take the pressure off Richmond, take the pressure off the Confederacy, and possibly put himself in a position again to threaten the capital. Now, the strategic situation of the war before Antietam is that the context of the war is changing. The Confederacy desperately needs to gain foreign recognition, especially from France and Britain. It's been pushing for this for over a year now. It's going to continue to push this for the entirety of the war. If you're interested in diplomatic history, I'd suggest you read some about Confederate diplomacy because it's absolutely terrible. Many of the people that were sent to Britain, in particular, as diplomats, had little to no diplomatic training. They weren't well received. They didn't interact well with the government, and that's part of the reason. It's a big part of the reason Confederacy finds the recognition basically impossible. We'll get to some of those in a bit. The Union desperately needs to prevent Confederate recognition. And by the time we get to the summer of 1862, Lincoln is really looking at, okay, slavery is going to be the wedge that will do that. Now, if you look at Union recruiting posters at the beginning of the Civil War in 1861, the posters all say basically the same thing. Join the fight and preserve the Union. The Union goal in 61 is to preserve the Union with slavery as a consideration, but a secondary consideration. Lincoln decides, and he writes up an Emancipation Proclamation, and Lincoln wants to use the slavery as a wedge to permanently distance Britain and France from the Confederacy. France had technically outlawed slavery during the Revolution in 1789. Britain had outlawed it in 33. There's an asterisk there because not all of these slaves in Britain were freed until 1844. Parliament basically bought the freedom of the slaves in the British Empire in 1833, and that's how it dealt with eliminating the institution of slavery inside of the empire. But both France and Britain, since the 1830s, had jointly acted to prevent the slave trade along West African coast into South Africa. And American slavers had come into conflict with them any number of times over the preceding 30 years or so, trying to keep the slave trade intact. The problem with the Emancipation Proclamation is this for Lincoln. He is fairly convinced it will work, but he needs a good victory in order to issue the proclamation. The reason being, if he doesn't have a victory, then the proclamation is going to seem like a desperate act rather than a brilliant strategic move. And it's also rather important to understand what the proclamation says and what it doesn't say. For some reason, and I just chalk this up to either very poor teaching or very poor reading, the Emancipation Proclamation does not free all the slaves inside the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation gives the Confederacy 90 days to quit fighting, and if they quit fighting within 90 days, they can keep their slaves. If they keep fighting after December 31st, 1862, then they will lose their slaves. So this is not what frees the slaves. It's an offer to the Confederacy to quit fighting, or you will free the slaves. Okay. Then the ultimate problem for the Union is you can say that you freed the slaves in the states that are under rebellion, but you have to be there on the ground to enforce it. The Confederate problem at this point is that it needs a decisive blow to threaten Union power. Most countries are still not convinced that the Confederacy is all that viable. The issue of slavery, of course, is a major concern to Britain and France and other countries inside Europe. It's not just Britain and France, but other powers who are looking at their Confederacy to trying to decide what to do are also generally very opposed to the institution of slavery by this point. And the Confederacy, again, had, if we go back and look at the Cornerstone speech, the secession documents, read the Confederate press, which is fascinating stuff. If you've never read Confederate newspapers, especially beginning in December of 1860, it's a really interesting read. So all the primary source material is there. This argument's actually getting a little droll at this point, in my opinion. But at the end of August, beginning of September of 1862, what you have is a very effective Union effort in the West, especially along the Mississippi Valley, the beginnings of a blockade. So the Confederacy is going to begin to start to feel the squeeze in 1862. There's no problem for blockade runners to run the blockade all throughout 1861, but by 1862, the Union Navy is growing. And by the end of 1862, the Union Navy is getting to the point where the blockade is beginning to become really effective. It's beginning to get harder and harder for the Confederacy to supply itself from foreign sources. And if you look at some of the origins of the Confederate problem, it's interesting because they all really adjacently have to do with slavery. So, for instance, one of the reasons the population of the free white population of the South was so low, and it wasn't in the North, is because when people started immigrating, you get major waves of immigration in the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s, all the way through the 50s. What are your options? Okay, well, I come from Ireland, I come from Scotland or Britain or France or wherever. I land in, let's say, New York. Well, what am I going to do? Go to the South? What can I do in the South? Is there any industry? No. Is there any arable farmland? Well, yeah, kind of, but not the sort that where you're going to grow a lot of comestibles, at least the way the economy was set up at the time. Which means, what do? You go to where there's a lot of free, or available land. And where is that? That's in the Midwest. Okay, Indiana, Ohio, places like Wisconsin and Michigan are opening up. Iowa, Kansas, places like that. Those are all opening up. Unless you come to the South, basically fairly well-to-do and able to purchase a lot of land and buy a lot of slaves, your options are kind of limited. That's one of the factors that never really gets spoken about. One of the other factors that's going to really start squeezing the Confederacy seriously in 1862 is the fact that they use so little land for comestibles that they're having a hard time feeding the population by 1862, because a lot of the states in the South, especially the Deep South, places like Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, had bought a lot of their food from places like Indiana and Illinois and Ohio. It had come down the Mississippi River. So a lot of these cracks that are beginning to form in the Confederacy are starting to really show up in 1862. The fact that they're just never able to wield as armies is big because they don't have the population. They can't manufacture, for the most part, they can't manufacture their own weapons. Are our weapons manufactured in the Confederacy? Yes, but not that many, especially considering the capacity for the Union. The population is not that big. They don't have the industrial base. And King Cotton is called King Cotton because of how the economic power of it. And all of these things are really starting to kind of trickle down. Another interesting technological facet that often gets overlooked looking at the manpower crisis in the Civil War beginning in 1862 is this. In the 1830s and 1840s, you see the development of the first effective farm machinery. Uh, like John Deere gets his start making farm machinery. And what happens is it's relatively inexpensive machinery, but it'll do the work of 6 or 7 or 8 people. So now not only do you have the ability to clear off much more land in places like Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, all these major farming states, you know, you don't need as many people to do the work, which means when it comes time for the war, when the war starts, you have a lot more free manpower that can go off to fight because technology is starting to kind of replace some of that. One of the big considerations for the Confederacy is this: how much manpower can you actually send by 1862? Now, most of us would sit back and think, well, why can't you send the bulk of the white male population? Well, you could, but are you going to send the bulk of the white male population when you're worried about a slave rebellion? So, strategically speaking, this is really considerably more complex than most people really think through it. And we could even go into more depth on some of these issues. But the Confederacy's kind of painted itself in a corner. It knows it has a limited amount of time. The generals, the politicians, the brighter ones at least, understand that they don't have an unlimited amount of time to fight this war. And they need to do something quickly or as fast as they practically can in order to bring this to a head to get the Union to quit. And Lee thinks at the end of August, beginning of September 1862, he has the opportunity to do so. And that is what is going to set us up for the Maryland campaign and Lee's advance through part of the valley into Maryland and the ultimate conflict at Antietam. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. Very, very good. Good introduction. Let's take questions from the floor. Who has some?
Do we just speak or raise our hands? How do you do it?
You can just speak if nobody else is speaking. There is a methodology for raising your hands, but you can just speak.
Okay, so one of the things I've noticed about the American Civil War, especially lately, is the rehabilitation of reputations such as James Longstreet and Joseph E. Johnston. And I
Mhm.
know, we're not doing Longstreet today, but even Johnston, basically what he was about to do at Richmond was surrender Richmond, or maybe not surrender it, but he wasn't going to fight for it. He
Mhm.
basically gets in one fight at Fair Oaks. He mismanages it. His Yeah, James Longstreet helps with that. And then he gets wounded and fortunately gets sent out west. So out there, I don't think he's any better, but that's not part of your talk. But the man doesn't seem to really want to fight. And what you just said towards the end of your discussion, there's an element of time that the Confederacy has, and they don't have a lot of it. But Johnson seems to think they have plenty of it, and this to me is one of the problems with Johnston. I not as sure as you are about Lee's brilliance in the 7 days. He's very good, but he's still giving his troops orders to do things that they're just not capable of doing. These people who are running his divisions don't have the skill that even the guys in the Mexican War did, basically. So he's asking a lot from a a newly formed army, but he does get the most out of them. And I failed to see where Johnson ever did that. As far as I know, he has one fight that he actually wins, and that's Kennesaw Mountain. And after that, Sherman says, "I'm never going to do that again." And basically just goes back to flanking him time after time. So, can you, I guess the question I'm asking, what is this thing with Joseph E. Johnson? Why do people think that he's, brilliant?
Well, I don't think most people would argue that Johnson is brilliant, but I think most people would argue that Johnson, to a certain extent, has a better strategic outlook than Lee ends up having. Um, this actually is a conversation that extends a little bit further along during the course of the war, but one of the things that Lee is kind of blinded to, even as early as 1862, is the fact that he wants to fight the war in Virginia and prosecute the war from there. He's always reluctant to release troops to go anywhere else. After the Gettysburg campaign, after Longstreet gets detached from him to go down south, that's a a bit of a crisis point for Lee. He never really wants to look at the bigger picture. Johnson had a little bit better, I think, overview of the big picture. But you are correct about his management on the battlefield. He's not brilliant. McClellan slowly beat him from Williamsburg all the way to the gates of Richmond. And your point is also very good about Lee, and that will come up later in the presentation talking about Antietam. One of Lee's key failings, and this comes up a lot in the Maryland campaign, is that he demands a tremendous amount from his troops that, training-wise, they're beginning to get a good sense of themselves, but physically, they just can't do. Jackson is bad about this. Lee is bad about this. I'll talk to a good extent about this after the last episode, talking about Lee's kind of assessment of the Maryland campaign in Antietam. But Lee goes on a number of rants about how and this is something that doesn't get discussed a lot in the historiography. Lee goes on a number of rants about how he's got all of these unreliable men who are shirking their duty and are basically not keeping up with the Army. And if you look at what Lee is demanding of them, what he's trying to do is force a lot of these men to march 15 or 20 miles a day. And when they're underfed, when they're underclothed, when they don't have the equipment they need. And he's beating his army to death. Actually, we'll talk about this some during the course of the later discussions in 1862. And then he complains about it. He rides around on a horse all day and complains that his men are dropping off like flies in the summer heat because they have to march 20 miles with 60 pounds of equipment. What I mentioned previously, too, about Lee in Western Virginia, and this shows up somewhat in the 7 days. But again, the 7 days is a much better series of operations for Lee, is that Lee has, and most American generals have, this sort of vision of Napoleonic warfare, where you'll outmaneuver your enemy, vis-a-vis something like Austerlitz, and basically make it impossible for them to fight you. And Lee's constantly trying to do this. Now, once or twice he pulls it off during the course of the war, but due to factors that arguably are uniquely American, but also have to do with time, space, and logistic constraints and the condition of the Army, he never really pulls it off on the scale he wants to. But that's what really crushed him in Western Virginia in 1861. And Lee never gives up on that. Look at the Gettysburg campaign. In this campaign, what we're going to see is his army is going to be broken up into several columns or corps and spread out, and expected to converge on any given point at any given time. Now, it works much better in the Valley, and it works much better in Pennsylvania and Maryland and the eastern part of Virginia than it ever would in Western Virginia because of the terrain and the road network. But this is going to be kind of signature Lee through the course of the war. And some of the material that's really come about to the surface about Lee since then really is his frustration with his army's inability to do some of these things. And it's not that his commanders don't understand it. It's not that his commanders don't have the knowledge to make it work if they had the ability to make it work. It's just that he demands things that, frankly, honestly, often just can't be done. And that is not a hypercritical revisionist view of Lee. It's a rather objective view of the way he fights the war.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question? It's about the the very determined defence of their capital made by the Confederates. Was the capital actually in some way materially important to the war effort, or was this more symbolic political issue? Can you discuss the importance of the Confederate capital and why it was so heavily defended?
Well, both D.C. and Richmond were both heavily defended. Would the loss of Richmond have ended the war? No. Would the loss of Washington, D.C. ended the war? No. It would have dislodged the government. It would have made it, it would have put the government on the road, but it certainly wouldn't have ended the war. There was nothing in Richmond in the summer of 1862 that would have crippled the Confederate government. Objectively, it simply wouldn't have. But there is this Union obsession with taking Richmond, all the way through really until Grant takes command. And by the time we get to the fall of 63 and the summer of 64, when Grant takes command, Grant is the one who finally realizes that, going after Richmond is stupid. There's no reason to take Richmond now. Taking Richmond in 1861 or 62 wouldn't have ended the war. Grant is the first one that objectively realizes that his goal should be destroying Lee's army, making Lee fight and fight and fight until he can't fight anymore. To really just crush the Confederate field forces. And that's what he does in conjunction with Sherman in 64. But again, I would argue that there is this sort of military and political obsession with Richmond itself. It's seen as the heart of the Confederacy. And even if McClellan had taken Richmond in 62, it wouldn't have ended the war. But it's an obsession. And you look at it from that point of view, and Richmond ends up being this sort of symbolic target for the Union. And it's going to cost them some of their worst defeats. And the one that really comes to mind in my mind is Fredericksburg, where Burnside is determined to cross at Fredericksburg and attack Richmond from that angle. It's really an obsession that the Confederacy is able to take advantage of. And to be honest, and I think this is objective, and I don't think anybody would fundamentally disagree with me, it wouldn't matter that they take a Richmond. Just move the government, somewhere else. Move it to someplace else in Virginia, or move it to, Charleston, South Carolina, or move it to Birmingham, Alabama. It would have been embarrassing. It would have been a loss to the Confederacy, but it would not have ended the war.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so if I can come up with another one along the same lines, the way I've thought of it, the way I perceive it, this isn't a Union military problem. This is a Lincoln problem. Lincoln is a great president, but he's the one who's pushing for this. And you mentioned Burnside. Burnside didn't want that command. He was told he had to take it. And
Right.
if Burnside had gotten the pontoons when he was supposed to get the pontoons, it might have worked.
It might have.
Lincoln's consistently doing this. The only person he doesn't get in the way of is Joseph E. Hooker, who's arguably one of his poorer choices because Hooker's basically lobbying for the job and stabbing people in the back to get it. So, I think Lincoln's the problem, not as a president, but he really, he overstepped his bounds when he got into the military thing. And your opinion on that?
Yeah, well, I think Lincoln wants to see the war prosecuted. And Lincoln, when we look at McClellan, for instance, or look at Meade after Gettysburg, Lincoln always wants to know, why aren't you pursuing? Why aren't you pursuing? Why aren't you pursuing? Now, we can argue counterfactually about why they didn't do that at various times. I think there's a really good reason why Meade doesn't pursue any faster than he does after Gettysburg. We'll talk about the battle, and we'll talk about September 17th and September 18th later on in the presentations. But Lincoln wants this war to end. He wants the rebellion over, and he wants his general fight. Now, it is Lincoln's prodding getting him to do so, but I don't think Lincoln was misplaced in his desire to get the generals to fight. I do think Lincoln, and Lincoln isn't terribly, Lincoln isn't micromanaging them, but what Lincoln is doing is replacing them when, you get this series of defeats or a series of inactions that are kind of prevalent through, especially the Army of the Potomac from the summer of 62 until the summer of 63. And that's his prerogative as president to prod them. And look at the involvement that FDR had in World War II and how FDR's opinion frequently and his political realities with Russia and Great Britain and the other allies forced him to put pressure on Marshall and others to shape operations the way that he wanted. I mean, it's a normal procedure for them to prod, and I don't think Lincoln was micromanaging it, but I also think that he was well within his powers and prerogative to expect his commanders to do something.
Okay, got any other questions out there? Okay, well, I think that's going to be it for tonight. Good introduction, good start, and we look forward to the rest of the campaign.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie.
All right.
All right, I'm going to stop recording.